raised in China. I was actually raised by my grandparents. My parents were working in a different city. And in China at that time, it was not uncommon that children were brought up by grandparents. My grandparents have a lot of friends. They became my friends as well. So I grew up basically with older people. I liked them, and I was very much inspired by my grandparents and their friends. Most of them still lived a very active life into their old age, and I was very convinced that older people still can live a very emotionally fulfilled life. I became interested in psychology when I was in high school. I learned that my grandfather actually tried to read child psychology when I was born in order to raise me right. So he told me some stories, what he read, so I became interested in psychology. My mother was interested in becoming a doctor, but she didn't have a chance. So she became a mathematician, in fact. So I determined to become a doctor to fulfill my mother's wish at that time. So I went to medical school. During medical school years, there was a psychiatrist who gave a series of lectures to the medical students at night. I remember the auditorium was packed during the lectures. So he talked about Freud. He talked about particularly the dream interpretation. So after that, I remember everyone tried to buy a copy of the Chinese translation of dream interpretation. So that was the first time that I learned about psychoanalysis, although I didn't really know what psychoanalysis was at that time. It was so difficult to really understand what dream interpretation was about. However, I was very interested. So after I came to America initially, I went to graduate school. I was doing molecular biology. However, for some reason that I always felt that I should proceed with on the road of psychoanalysis. So after a postdoctoral fellowship, I decided to pursue this direction. So the only way for me to do it is first to become a psychiatrist. In fact, I didn't know what is the right way to get to psychoanalysis. I thought that becoming a psychiatrist automatically would have some way to learn psychoanalysis. But of course, during that time, I learned that I need to go to analytic training. I was very lucky that the program I was in, which is Albert Einstein College of Medicine, during my training, most of my supervisors were psychoanalysts. So I got a chance to learn psychodynamic psychotherapy, and was also highly encouraged by my supervisors to pursue towards this direction. So I always feel that I would like to work with elderly, not particularly, knowing that there was any issue in this area. I always feel comfortable talking with elderly, and I decided to do geriatric psychiatry fellowship as soon as I started my residency training in psychiatry, and learned that our program does have fellowship opportunity. And at the time I started geriatric psychiatry fellowship training, I also started analytic training. So I was referred by a psychiatrist to see an elderly patient for psychoanalysis. And I happened to have a supervisor who was interested in aging issues, who never questioned whether I should treat this patient or not. So she gladly supervised me on this case. And later I had a mentor who never questioned the problem treating elderly. So she mentored me for writing. So I wrote up a paper about this case. I only learned about issues that people for many years in this field were reluctant to treat elderly during my presentation as a graduation in my institute. So people were very supportive during my presentation. What I learned was, and the people were very supportive and admiring the fact that I actually treated an elderly. So from how people commented that how they were inspired by my presentation, I learned that there was an issue in this field. So that was the beginning of my awareness of this reluctance in psychoanalytic field that people hesitate to treat elderly. So China has an ancient history of respecting elderly. So aging symbolizes wisdom and emotional maturity. And traditionally, younger people always went to elderly for advice, for decision. Of course, that in reality is not always working out, but there is a general sense of respect for elderly on people's mind. So there was no question on my mind since I was born that we should not treat elderly, or there should be any problem treating elderly in any way. And also from my personal experience with my grandparents, friends, and I was convinced that there shouldn't be any difference in treating them analytically than treating younger people. And in fact, from what I learned of Western culture, and in much older cultures, for instance, I learned ancient Rome, one philosopher, Cicero, was very much favored aging. And I think the ripeness with aging was also part of his idea as well. However, in American culture, and there is a difference from the ancient Western culture, and of course different from ancient Oriental history as well. American is a youth-oriented country. It is relatively a new country. So when European people immigrated to America several hundreds of years ago, they got to survive. So they didn't have, I think, the previous generations to direct them, to give them support. They had to survive here. So it is perhaps encouraging the youth-oriented cultural development. So in America, it felt that people had to keep young, and they strive to be young. So it feels very different. There is a notion that in the elderly, there is a shift from the external-oriented, external achievement-oriented direction to internal growth. The physical state of aging puts increasing limitation on activities in daily living. However, the unconscious or the intrapsychic life still goes on. I think psychoanalytic treatment can open up an opportunity to bring elderly patients' intrapsychic life up to a higher level of appreciation in our conscious mind. Psychoanalysis can provide a process to rework our inner tension and anxiety. So therefore, it can bring out the sense of vitality, enrichment of emotional life, and a peace of mind about the inevitable death. I think psychoanalysis has a special place in treating elderly patients in their end stage of life. In my imagination, I view life course in a three-dimensional helix image. So this three-dimensional helix starts with this leading point, taking up from the ground, growing in a circular direction, but always moving upwards. So each circle is at a higher level than the previous circles. And it does have an end. However, the end is at the highest point of the helix. So I want to convey two messages from this structure. One is that each circle, which perhaps represent each developmental stage of life, is built upon the previous stages. However, it is always at a higher level than the previous stages. And the second one is there is the highest point, which represent that we all have the potential to achieve the highest level of emotional maturity at the end of our lives. From a developmental point of view, that each stage of life is evolved from the previous stage, and is impacted upon by the previous stages of development. So from my experience working with elderly, I have noticed repeatedly that my patients, when they're aging, they not only achieve quantitatively but also qualitatively different new levels of emotional maturity and mastery of their lives altogether. For example, psychoanalysis can help elderly patients deal with their unresolved internal conflicts which happened in their early life, which had never become an issue until at their later stage of life when they're encountering physical vulnerability and dealing with losses in life. So during those stressful times at this stage of life, the earlier conflicts might become in a way which otherwise they didn't become a huge obstacle during their younger years. So working with elderly in terms of the psychoanalytic process or the quality of the work, it feels very similar to working with younger adults. However, working with elderly patients feels unique in a number of ways. The transference issues are more complicated, and the countertransference issues is also more complicated. Working with elderly patients require the analysts being more flexible because of some realistic issues. For instance, elderly patients are more vulnerable physically. You have to deal with the realistic health issues from time to time, and it becomes more complicated when sometimes we have to ascertain how much is realistic and how much is, in fact, psychological. Nevertheless, so it's perhaps more likely to have more chances to deal with real issues. And also, another unique thing working with elderly is that you really deal with in the stage of life issues, which is very different from the younger patients. In elderly patients, there are many unique end of the life stage issues. For instance, multiple losses in life, their own illnesses, and the children may not be by their side, and they also have grandchildren. That itself is something new. From my experience, however, working with elderly patients, I found that they are, in fact, more open. They're more accepting, maybe more receptive and reflective. They're more ready to explore. So overall, it has been a great experience working with elderly patients. So my first elderly patients in analysis was a training case when I was in analytic training, and I treated a 90-year-old patient who came to me with death anxiety and depression. And so the fear of death resolved during analysis. Of course, that was very much rewarding. I think the countertransference part, that how the analysts were reluctant to treat elderly historically for so many years, has several underlying factors. Definitely the cultural background might be one. Another thing is the analysts may not have resolved some of the issues with their own parents and the grandparents. Perhaps another one is, the analysts also, just like patients, are evolving during our developmental process. And perhaps analysts do not have the chance to work on late-stage life issues during analysts' own training analysis. So I think we might need to also down the road think about what would be the best way to address that issue in training and in our personal analysis. Freud's statement about older patients above 50 was not analyzable, I think was interesting. And at that time, he was almost 50 himself. And he, in fact, lived into his 80s, and he was intellectually very active. So there are many factors, I believe, affecting why he decided that people above 50 were not analyzable. And also, I believe people at that time did not live as a long life as people are now. So the medical advances probably contributed to the longevity or the lifespan, the longer lifespan of modern people. So people in general are healthier physically nowadays than more than a century ago. I'm so glad to be part of the International Psychoanalytic Association Committee on Perspectives on Aging. And I hope that our committee really can inspire and influence the culture in the world to be interested in treating elderly. So we hope that we can contribute in a significant degree towards that direction.